Welcome, everyone. We are so excited to be here today to introduce you to GFI's new plant-based meat consumer segmentation, which provides a framework to explore opportunities to grow plant-based meat consumption. My name is Jody Kirshner, and I'm the Associate Director of Market Insights at GFI. I'm joined by my colleague, Taylor Lead-Otley, who is GFI's Consumer Research Lead, and we will be walking you through the presentation today. Before we dive in, just a few housekeeping items. So first, this webinar will be recorded and it will be posted to our YouTube channel. We'll also be emailing everyone who has registered a copy of the recording afterwards. Second, we ask that you please ask your questions in the Q&A box rather than in the chat. This helps us keep track of them more easily. You're welcome to ask questions throughout the webinar, but we will be answering them all at the end. So our colleague Chelsea Hammersmith will join us at the end to help us lead the Q&A session. For those of you who may be new to the work of the Good Food Institute, we are an international nonprofit organization developing the roadmap for a sustainable, secure, and just protein supply. We identify the most effective solutions, mobilize resources and talent, and empower partners across the food system to make alternative proteins accessible, affordable, and delicious. We work across three key areas: science and technology, corporate engagement, and policy. And we have teams working in 7 regions around the world, addressing unique dynamics for alternative proteins in those regions. All of us on the call today are part of the Corporate Engagement Market Insights team at GFI here in the US. And our team's work really aims to measure and contextualize demand for alternative proteins. So we do that by conducting primary consumer research on various topics and of various types, including work like the segmentation that we'll share today. We also analyze the market, tracking data like retail and food service sales and household buying trends. And all of our research and analysis is published and available on the GFI website. A quick overview of what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to start with just a bit of background on why we developed this consumer segmentation, how we can use a framework like this, and our methodology. We'll get into the findings, including an overview of the 6 unique consumer segments we identified in the market and the benefits of plant-based meat that appear to resonate most with them. And finally, we'll share a few details on things we're working on as a follow-up. And then, as we mentioned, have lots of time for questions at the end. So before we jump into the content, we wanted to just start with a quick poll. We were curious to understand how familiar everyone in the audience is with consumer segmentations. So we're going to pop a question up here in a minute and just give you a minute to answer. And again, just trying to understand how familiar you are with the idea of consumer segmentations. Okay, just give it another second here for folks to pick an answer, and then we can take a quick look at the results. Okay, great. So we got a pretty good diversity in the audience here. Some folks that have used segmentations before, some that are familiar with the idea in general, and then some that don't know too much. So that's super helpful for us as we get into this next part of the presentation. Okay, so we wanted to start by providing some context on why we even embarked on this work. We see plant-based meat, the category has really reached a critical juncture. As many of you probably know, the category gained a lot of traction with early adopters, experienced some years of really solid growth, but sales have declined in the past couple of years. Today, less than 15% of US households purchase plant-based meat in retail annually, and plant-based meat consumers say they're only eating the products maybe 2 to 3 times a month on average. So to expand to a larger mainstream market and grow consumption, just grow that frequency, we really see the need for a more nuanced understanding of consumers. And a segmentation provides that framework essentially. It divides consumers into distinct groups based on attitudes, needs, behaviors, and it helps us identify the groups that are most open to switching to plant-based meat. And importantly, it gives us insights on how we can reach those consumers more effectively and efficiently. Just as a bit of a side note, if we look at conventional meat categories, or if we, of course, look across other food or CPG categories, we see widespread use of segmentation frameworks like this. So just for example, on the conventional meat side, some of the checkoff programs have funded publicly available segmentations for several meat categories. And while we're all looking at the same consumers, for the most part, at the end of the day, the ways we break them down and understand them are going to be unique. And again, we really see a need to have that perspective specific to plant-based meat. So before we get into the details on the segments we identified, we wanted to just share a bit of background on consumer segmentations and how they can be used, which hopefully will be helpful context for those of you that are maybe less familiar with this construct. So I mentioned we're going to be essentially dividing consumers into distinct groups. And for each group, we're going to build a pretty comprehensive picture of who these consumers are and what they care about. So we'll know, for example, their average demographic profile, their attitudes and perceptions, what they eat, where and how they shop, and various other attributes. So we're going to focus on a few of these buckets today, but eventually we will be publishing sort of a complete picture of all these segments across all these different dimensions. So I mentioned we're going to talk about a number of consumer segments that exist in the market that we've identified, and they may all provide distinct opportunities. But the value in a segmentation is really in choosing a segment or maybe a couple of segments to target. So just again, thinking about a target segment can help provide focus for positioning and key marketing activities to help make them more effective and efficient. And as you think about, looking at these segments and trying to think about what the best target might be for, a given brand or for a given activity, it really is going to be unique to that brand or to that activity. It could be based on, that choice could be based on where there's strong strategic fit, where there's an advantage versus competitors or versus other choices, or where there's a lot of opportunity for growth, or some combination of all of those things. It's also helpful to keep in mind, again, as we're looking at these segments and we might look at different sizes and some might seem relatively smaller or larger, that choosing a target segment doesn't mean you're only going to attract or speak to consumers in that segment. So the strategies that you might undertake to meet a target segment's demand are going to attract some consumers from other segments inevitably who share various attitudes and preferences. So those consumers are also an important source of volume. So with a target segment in mind, the segmentation can be a really powerful tool to inform a variety of strategic activities. So we've just mentioned a few here as examples, but for example, you can identify specific communication messages that might appeal to certain segments, and you can know how to reach them with those messages, importantly. So for example, if we were just looking at an overall market level, we might say health is really important to consumers and we should talk about that. But when we focus on a certain segment, we have information to be much more targeted with that message. So we might know if that segment cares about heart health or protein or calories, or we might know if we should focus on not having to compromise between taste and health. So all that nuance comes from, again, understanding those segments and identifying a segment to focus on. Similarly, a segmentation can be really helpful to inform things like product development or packaging, can provide insights on what product attributes a target segment cares most about and what you might want to highlight for them on packaging with claims, for example. Or a segmentation could inform distribution. So it can help you understand for a given target segment where those consumers live, where they shop, and how best to actually find them and sell them your product. So those are just a few examples of the ways a segmentation can be really useful across a range of different functions. Okay, now getting into what we actually did to develop this segmentation. So the basis for our segmentation was a really robust quantitative study. We worked with a large research provider and surveyed several thousand US consumers aged 18 to 59. We did cap the upper age here because we know from past research that this demographic group is the most open to plant-based eating in general, and they will make up increasingly the bulk of buying consumers as time goes on. We did screen to include only consumers who were eating meat or dairy today, so any conventional or plant-based meat or dairy, but that, as you can imagine, ends up being almost everyone in the US. Based on the survey data, we further narrowed in on what we've called the addressable market for plant-based meat. And we're going to refer to this throughout, and I'm going to talk about it a little bit more on the next slide. But essentially, this is consumers who say they're at least somewhat open to consuming plant-based foods in the future. And then within that addressable market, we used statistical clustering analysis to separate consumers into those unique segments based on attributes like their food and lifestyle attitudes, their perceptions of plant-based meat, and their current meat consumption. We then leveraged all that data we had collected in that survey to profile these segments to really understand who they are and what they care about. We also did some follow-on qualitative research via one-on-one interviews with consumers in select segments to build a really deep understanding of their needs. So a bit more detail on that addressable market I mentioned. So the addressable market, as I alluded to, includes consumers with any amount of openness to plant-based meat or dairy today. So I'll just note that we included plant-based dairy here because we know it is obviously a bigger category, but also it can be an entry point for consumers to plant-based eating in general. So we did want to cast a fairly wide net, sort of thinking forward as to who might be open to plant-based meat in the future. So this addressable market, as I just defined it, ended up being 71% of our total survey audience. Again, that's those US consumers aged 18 to 59. The remaining 29% of those consumers we refer to as rejectors because they just essentially expressed little to no interest in plant-based products. And we did want to keep them separate so we weren't muddying our understanding of those addressable segments. So going forward, everything we talk about will be within this context of the addressable market. So this is a pretty coarse way to separate the market, but even at this high level, just breaking it into these two groups, we do start to see some differences emerge between them. So the addressable market is generally a bit younger. They're more likely to have kids at home and to live in urban areas. When they think about meat or protein in general, health is a top consideration for them. They're also more likely to think about specific nutrients and about energy. On the other hand, rejectors tend to be a little bit older, to not have kids at home, to live in suburban areas. And for them, meat and protein is primarily for taste. So that's not to say health isn't a consideration. It's still on the list, but it is secondary to taste. They're also more likely to turn to meat or protein to fill them up or to build muscle. So these differences are subtle in some cases, but they do have a big impact on how these consumers approach protein choices and the value they see or don't see in plant-based meat. So with that background, now let's meet the segments. So as I mentioned, all of this going forward now is within the context of that addressable market. So these are all consumers who expressed some amount of openness to plant-based eating in the future. And within that addressable market, we identified 6 unique consumer segments that have distinct attitudes and motivations and perceptions of plant-based meat. And I'm going to go through a quick snapshot of each of the segments, and then we'll, in the rest of the presentation, get into a little bit more detail on them. So just a quick note before I start going through them one by one. We have not explicitly ordered these segments by priority or opportunity size. So if you've worked with segmentations in the past, and in particular, if you've done them through the lens of a brand, you very often would order the segments based on the priority or the opportunity size for that brand. But for us approaching this at a category level, we expect there's going to be different opportunities for different brands or different products or different use cases within this framework. So instead, we've organized them here based on their current openness to reducing conventional meat, which also works well to keep them in a logical order in terms of having segments with related attitudes next to each other. It's also important to note that this is not necessarily 100% aligned with current plant-based meat consumption, and we'll take a closer look at that shortly. So let's walk through the segments, get to know them a little bit, starting from the segment most open to reducing conventional meat today. So we call this segment the ethical alternative seekers. It is a relatively smaller segment, but the one most leaning into plant-based eating. These are conscientious consumers. They care deeply about issues like sustainability and animal welfare. And importantly, and what differentiates them from some of the other segments is they really actually do make food choices based on these beliefs today. A large portion of them are vegetarian or vegan already, or they say they're eating less conventional meat than they used to. And just a note here, when we refer to conventional meat, we're talking about animal-based meat products. So these consumers are generally pretty concerned about what they put in their body. They give it a lot of thought. They might look for foods that are organic or natural, for example. They do tend to be a bit younger. They have smaller households. They're ethnically diverse and slightly more likely to be female. Next, we have the health conscious compromisers. So this is a group of consumers who really care about their health and they worry about the impact of what they eat. They, in particular, sort of think forward to sort of things like heart disease and take a very preventative approach to some of those issues. They're proactive about looking for options that are better for them, but they also really care about taste and variety in what they eat. And they often do feel some conflict between those priorities, like they have to choose one or the other. They do recognize some health issues around eating conventional animal meat, and some of them are eating less of it than they used to as a result. But again, taste and price are a top priority for them, and those are key barriers that limit some of their plant-based meat consumption today. This group does tend to be a little bit older, a little bit more likely to be female, a little bit less likely to have kids at home, which probably relates to being just slightly older and in a different life stage. Next, we have nutrition-focused integrators. So this is also a segment that cares about health, but in a slightly more specific and nuanced way compared to the health-conscious compromisers. So the nutrition-focused integrators think about very specific nutrients in their food. They read food labels. They're generally very particular about what they put in their bodies. But they do also enjoy the experience of food. They like cooking and exploring new foods. They also recognize some issues with eating conventional meat. So they recognize there's maybe some health issues. They recognize some of the sustainability issues. And they have integrated plant-based meat in their diet as a result, but they are still typically eating conventional meat as well. Next, we have protein maximizers. So as this name suggests, this segment is very focused on protein in their diet. They see protein and meat specifically both as a comfort food, so they have some emotional attachment, but it's also a way to look and feel their best. So they think about and talk about benefits like building muscle and having energy as outcomes of eating meat and protein. They do have diverse emotional attachments to eating traditional conventional meat. So for example, they are more likely than others to say they see it as part of their culture, and they may even be eating more of it. A good number of them say they are. But they are also open to plant-based meat, again, as another source of lean protein in their diet, given that that's something they're very focused on. This segment is majority millennials, slightly more likely to be male, and likely to have kids at home. Next, we have carefree considerers. So this is generally a slightly younger segment, and they have, relative to the other segments, relatively few health concerns or goals, which is probably just related to being, a little younger, maybe having not faced certain health issues yet themselves, and just sort of not being in the life stage where some of those things have become salient to them. They tend to say they don't worry much about what they eat, and they do tend to stick to what they know. So they're quite routine driven in that respect. Similar to the protein maximizers, this carefree considerers group does have some emotional attachment to conventional meat, and some of them also are eating more of it than they used to. This is a group that says generally, yeah, they would consider eating plant-based meat, but currently they tend to know very little about it, and they don't necessarily understand the benefits or see many reasons to consider it themselves. And finally, we have the value-driven skeptics. So this segment is probably the closest to the rejectors while still being at least somewhat open to plant-based meat. So they are generally, as consumers, very taste and price driven in their food choices. They tend to feel conventional meat is, just a natural thing to eat. It's part of their routine. They don't necessarily give it a lot of thought. And again, similar to the carefree considerers, this group doesn't outright reject the idea of plant-based meat. Some of them have even tried it, but they aren't necessarily convinced it's a good choice for them. And in particular, they tend to have concerns around the price and taste gaps with a lot of the products today. So that's the whirlwind introduction to the segments. We'd love to do another quick poll here and just have folks in the audience indicate which segment you feel like you might fall into based on this quick overview. All right, just give it another second here, and then we'll take a look at the results. Interesting. Not entirely surprised by that. Super interesting to see, though, where people feel they might fall themselves. All right, so at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Taylor, and he's going to walk through more details on who these segments are, what they're eating today, and importantly, what they really care about looking forward.
Thank you, Jody. And let's jump over to the next slide. So now that Jody gave us an overview of our 6 segments, we're going to get into some of their key behaviors and needs to figure out what opportunities and challenges they pose for the plant-based meat market today. And as a reminder to kind of jump back a couple of slides almost, all 6 of these segments fall into what we call the addressable market for plant-based proteins. So they're all at least somewhat open to consuming plant-based meat and dairy today. But as we'll see on this slide, and as we'll get into, their actual levels of engagement with plant-based meat and their reasons for engaging with it vary, sometimes pretty widely across the segments. So what we're looking at here is how each segment compares to the others on some key behaviors. This first page is going to be pretty focused on plant-based meat consumption, but we'll also talk about their relationships to conventional meat and other plant-based products on the next couple of pages. Quick note on how to read this page. Everything that you see in green means the segment is at least 20% higher than the average of the other segments in the addressable market. And red means they're at least 20% lower than average. This is just like a standard threshold that we use in market research to show when a segment is meaningfully different than others. And you can see there's pretty broad differences across big chunks of the segments on the page. So for some of these metrics, we could have very well even selected a higher threshold. This is more to illustrate high-level differences in clusterings. So the big finding here, I would say, is that our first 4 segments, the ethical alternative seekers, the health conscious compromisers, the nutrition focused integrators, and the protein maximizers, show much higher engagement with plant-based meat today than the remaining 2 segments. And because of that, this kind of makes them seem like the best near-term opportunities to maintain and increase plant-based meat consumptions. These segments, these 4, also account for about 57% of people in the addressable market, but they're actually over 80% of current plant-based meat eaters today. So they're disproportionately engaged with the category. They're all also obviously at least somewhat engaged with plant-based meat, but they have different levels of actual consumption today, which points to different opportunities. So let's talk quickly through what's driving these levels of plant-based meat consumption. For the ethical alternative seekers, this is going left to right. They're the first one in that dark blue column. Many of them are vegetarian, flexitarian, or otherwise have already started or finished eliminating conventional meat from their diets. A lot of them are also obviously eating lots of other plant-based proteins because of this. We'll get into that in a couple of pages. But for them, plant-based meat is really another option that can add variety to their diets. They might reach for it, for example, when they want something meatier than like their usual plant-based options. For those next 3 segments, the compromisers, the integrators, and the maximizers, plant-based meat for them seems like it's more of a healthy protein. For a lot of them, it might often be a direct swap for conventional meat that they'd otherwise be eating, especially for those health-conscious compromisers. For the protein maximizers, for example, it might be something that they eat additionally to get extra protein into their diets. So we see that the segments represent different sizes of opportunity today, and we can already see kind of high-level patterns emerging that might make them gravitate towards different products. Their relationships with plant-based meat are essentially part 1 of the story. So let's jump to the next slide, and we are going to talk through their relationships to conventional meat. So while all of these segments are open to and at least somewhat eating plant-based meat today, there's actually only a couple of them who report having reduced or reducing their conventional meat consumption as well. Those are the two on the left that we have highlighted in green. These are the ethical alternative seekers and the health conscious compromisers. So a significant number of the people in these two segments have eliminated or reduced conventional meat from their diets, especially for the ethical alternative seekers, those ones in the far left. There's a high proportion of vegetarians and vegans in this segment, and they actually tend to cluster disproportionately in this segment. So there's not a whole lot of vegetarians and vegans in the remaining segments. So while the other consumers in the segments to the right of these two may have added plant-based meat to their diet today, they're not primarily doing it, or at least they don't seem like they're primarily doing it in order to reduce the amount of conventional meat they're eating. Especially segments like the protein maximizers and the carefree considerers, as we get further over to the right side of the screen, they're even reporting that they're eating more conventional meat than they have been in the recent past, even as they're decently engaged with or open to the plant-based meat category. These two consumer segments on the right are also the ones, probably not coincidentally, that are most likely to express emotional attachments to conventional meat, as well as often seeing it as good on important benefits to them, like high protein, especially for those protein maximizers. So we often talk, like as GFI, about how omnivores and meat eaters represent the biggest market opportunities for plant-based meat. And the segmentation gives us another lens on that. Like we can see that's largely true here, with a lot of the vegetarian and vegan consumers clustering into one relatively small segment. But it also adds a layer to our understanding. Like most of the segments and most of the addressable market is omnivores and meat eaters. So with that, let's also talk about their relationship to plant-based products, which is kind of part three of this story of consumption. So let's jump on to the next page. So, well, we defined the segments in this study primarily on how the behaviors and attitudes they told us about affect their plant-based meat consumption and openness. We also saw that differences in their other plant-based product consumption emerged from this. So this was kind of like a nice side benefit in terms of how well it explains their openness to plant-based categories. One note on the terminology here, when we say non-analog plant proteins in that second row, we define that for consumers as things like tofu, black bean burgers, things that people might choose instead of conventional meat in some eating occasions, but that aren't always marketed using like, terms or formats from conventional meat in the same way that the analog plant-based meat products tend to be. So that's just how we define them. Plant-based milk or plant-based dairy in that bottom row includes things like plant-based milk, cheeses, etc. Although most of the consumption that we see here was driven by plant-based milk, just because that tends to be the largest segment in the plant-based dairy category. So as you might expect, the segments that are most engaged with plant-based meat are also typically consuming other plant-based meat, plant-based dairy and other protein products. In almost every case, they have above average consumption of non-analog plant proteins. So again, like those tofus and black bean burgers. The big exception here, and this is where we can start to see nuances creep in between even like the very addressable segments, is the protein maximizers. They're not eating non-analog plant proteins as often, like they're not switching back and forth between tofu and plant-based meat burgers for the most part. And we think this is pretty consistent with their general attachment to conventional meat. We expect based on that they're just drawn to products that mimic the experience of conventional meat and have higher protein content. One other notable thing here too, every segment except the skeptics on the far right are also more likely to be eating plant-based meat analogs than non-analogs like tofu and black bean burgers. So even though these products have been on the market for obviously much longer, very notable that all the segments in the addressable market have really quickly tended to gravitate towards these more meaty plant-based meat analog solutions. So the overall takeaway here, two kind of punchlines to this page is one, that there's pretty high overlap between the target consumers for analog and non-analog products. It's often going to be one consumer making a choice between analog and non-analog products based on their needs or preferences in a specific occasion. And because of that, all of these segments are also going to be more likely to be drinking plant-based meat and or plant-based milk today, sorry, than they are to be eating plant-based meat. So in a sense, they all show greater openness to plant-based food than their plant-based meat consumption alone would suggest. This points to opportunities to deepen their relationship to plant-based products. Next page. And we can just flash up the whole thing here. Let's not get too deep into the animation. So give us a couple of clicks forward because I'm just going to cover everything. Yeah, perfect. Thank you. So based on the attitudes and the needs of each segment, and given what we know about their consumption patterns today, we wanted to share a perspective on what might motivate them to eat more plant-based meat. This is a very simplified snapshot of that. There's obviously going to be a lot more information coming out in the full report, which we'll talk through in a couple of pages. Again, here, the colored cells are going to represent attributes that are important to each segment. And the bold text within cells is going to show the areas of overlap across the segment. So this is a map of shared and distinct needs across the addressable market. And what we can take away from this is that there's usually 2 to 3 consumer segments who are united in looking for any specific benefit, whether that's sustainability, health, protein, being less processed, et cetera. But no segment shares the majority of the benefits they're looking for with any other single segment. So there's many points of overlap, but everyone is overall distinct. Those points of overlap, health is the big one. If we look at the top row here, this unpacks some of the nuances and the levels of importance in the specific aspects of health that are most relevant to each segment. So, for example, the ethical alternative seekers associate plant-based meat with protein, with giving them energy. It's very added benefits for them, whereas the health-conscious compromisers think of them as a better for you option, helping them avoid some potential negative effects of conventional meat. And then we can see certain segments share different attributes with each of those, right? Like energy is shared between the ethical alternative seekers and the protein maximizers, as well as the carefree considerers. So a lot of diversity, even when we talk about a shared benefit that people are looking for on a very high level, like health. As we go to the bottom of the page, each segment also has specific barriers that we think are limiting or holding back their plant-based meat consumption today and could be potentially addressed to drive growth. So this includes some things that are product specific, things like being processed, very concrete things like taste and price. As we get more into the right-hand segments too, we also tend to see some more of the barriers here being driven by things like beliefs, high-level food attitudes, and routines that might be more challenging to address, like as a specific brand or a specific type of product, for example. So for an example of that, segments like the integrators and the maximizers in the middle and the skeptics on the far right believe that eating meat is necessary to have a healthy diet and that it's something natural. Many of them also see meat as comfort food, which are things that are very difficult to address in a direct product marketing perspective. So because of this diversity, we're going to spend the remaining time before the Q&A focusing in on these left 4 segments, just based on their high existing engagement with the category and some of the similarities that we see. There's overlapping needs around things like health, naturalness, energy, et cetera. So let's jump to the next page. So for these 4 segments, health is the big common denominator, but not the only reason why they would choose plant-based meat. But we're going to unpack a little bit about what they're looking for that's shared and different in a health-specific context on this page. The differences in what they're looking for and how they define healthy when it comes to plant-based meat, we think have pretty important implications for what marketing or product formulation strategies might be effective to engage each of these segments and get them to eat more plant-based meat. Starting from the top, second to top, actually, in this case, the health conscious compromisers see plant-based meat as a better for you option, for example. So, like we kind of mentioned this on a previous page, they see it associated with having less fat and cholesterol than other consumer segments, which they might see as helping them avoid issues that can result from conventional meat consumption, things like heart disease. Also aligns nicely with their demographic profile, with them being a little bit older than the ethical alternative seekers, who tend to skew a little bit younger. They also tend to recognize that it's a good choice to avoid hormones and steroids that can be found in some conventional meats. Moving a little further down, the nutrition-focused integrators are more focused on like the let's say, nutrient configuration of plant-based meat, specific things on back of pack like protein, vitamins, and minerals. So they also probably, like those health conscious compromisers, are probably thinking about the long-term health implications of choice of things like heart disease, cancer. They're also getting up towards a similar age range as those consumers, but very differently. They feel like conventional meat also provides some health benefits. So for them, we think there's room for plant-based meat to improve by delivering on the things that they're actually looking to conventional meat for, things especially like protein. And then finally, the protein maximizers, they see plant-based meat as a lean protein option. A lot of them already see it as comparable to conventional meat on some of those key aspects like protein, especially lean meats like chicken. But they also see conventional meat as delivering some things that they don't associate as much with plant-based meat today. So things like protein, many of them would be motivated by higher protein products. And many of them also still have that underlying belief that they do need meat to have a healthy diet. And then finally, let's actually jump back to the top for just a second here. So the ethical alternative seekers, a little bit different than the other segments. They're actually less health driven. That's probably coming from them being on the lower end of the age spectrum, and often coming to plant-based meat for these other reasons like sustainability, animal welfare, rather than coming to it primarily for health reasons. But despite that, also see it as a good source of protein, similar to that nutrition focused integrator segment. Also, they have a very different frame of reference for protein in general, right? A lot of them are vegetarian, already following plant-based diet. So their frame of reference for things like healthy and high protein, where it might be like a chicken breast for other segment, might actually be a brick of tofu or a black bean burger for this segment. Next page. So we kind of use the ethical alternative seekers as our jumping off point to start talking about those higher level benefits that we were getting into a bit on the previous page, like sustainability benefits, ethical, other sort of high level ethical and social things. So let's briefly cover those for the other four segments because all of them associate at least some higher order benefits with plant-based meat. So there is first, awareness of sustainability and animal welfare benefits across several of the segments, but we don't think they're the reason that most of them are choosing plant-based meat today, potentially apart from those ethical alternative seekers. Like it's not driving their plant-based meat behavior, at least today. Um, so again, the ethical alternative seekers already most motivated by these sort of ethical benefits, and that's probably also a key reason that a lot of them have already reduced or eliminated conventional meat from their diet. So this is already a met benefit for them. Like it's something that the products are doing really well, that they're satisfied with, and that's obviously a big competitive advantage for plant-based meat versus conventional. For the remaining three segments, they tend to have some nuances in what they're actually looking for. So the health conscious compromisers, high levels of concern with animal welfare that's shared with the ethical alternative seekers. And this is like a reason that they would consider reducing their conventional meat consumption, but it's secondary to their health issues. And as we saw, not a lot of them are actually acting on it today. Like they still have quite a bit of conventional meat in their diet. So we see this as an unmet opportunity for plant-based meat to help drive some future consumption. The other two segments, the nutrition-focused integrators and the protein maximizers, show varying levels of awareness about sustainability and sort of ethical consumption issues. Some of them suggested in our quant survey that it might make them consider eating less meat, but obviously not a lot of them are following through on that because they're overwhelmingly meat eating, and many of them are eating more meat today than in recent years. So looking forward, yes, some role for ethical and social benefits, but they're not as top of mind for any of the most engaged segments as health benefits, for example, as we saw on the previous page. Finally, next page, the punchline. You may have noticed that we didn't spend almost any time talking about taste and price yet when discussing the segments. And it's not because these things don't matter. If we think back to like the big macro level of who's in the addressable market for plant-based meat, taste was important to almost everyone. And people who weren't open to plant-based meat today, those rejectors, like that 29% of the market, tend to be more taste motivated than people who are open to plant-based meat. So overall, like, yes, this suggests that improving plant-based meat products' taste and sensory characteristics is going to be an effective way to bring more people into the addressable market. But as we think about the addressable market today in the short term, higher level benefits are probably needed in the short term to get people more engaged. So let's dig into the nuances of that, right? Like taste expectations, price sensitivity, those things do vary by segment here among these four addressable segments, but they're bigger barriers today for some than for others. So starting with the health conscious compromisers and the value driven skeptics, those top two columns, they have a similar profile here, right? They tend to be more influenced by taste and price issues today than the other two segments. This is a big barrier to them eating more plant-based meat. And likely because of this, we think they're a more likely segment to lapse from plant-based meat today or just be eating it less frequently than some of the other segments. So we can think of this as almost a retention factor, things that the products could improve on in order to reattract consumers who are less engaged today. The bottom two, the nutrition-focused integrators and the plant-based maximizers, not as dissatisfied with taste or motivated by it as the first two segments, but do express some particular issues with the texture of plant-based meat. So a lot of them suggested that they might be eating more of these products in more occasions if it could more closely match the texture of conventional meat, which is really interesting. And then finally, the ethical alternative seekers, again, they're kind of the odd ones out in terms of conventional meat expectations. They're more likely to think of plant-based meat as already pretty tasty. Again, probably because they're comparing it to products like tofu, black bean burgers that are less meaty tasting. Again, their set of benchmarks is probably a little bit different than the other consumers here today. So that was a lot of information, and let's just jump onto the page because there's quite a bit more that will also be coming down the pipe. That's the foundational understanding of the plant-based meat consumer today. But we're going to be working on this quite a bit more. We also have additional reporting and research that will be coming out later in this year that's going to give more direction on how to apply and use these segments when planning out your approach to the plant-based meat market. So in the near term, a bunch of additional data that will get published in a comprehensive report that will complement the summary that you're going to get after the webinar today. This will cover things like purchase behavior in addition to consumption behavior, product format and occasion preferences, shopping habits, all those sorts of things to kind of figure out how to connect to segments in the places where they're eating and choosing plant-based meat. Second, because so many of the segments, as we saw, were motivated by health and nutrition. Doing a series of studies on those topics to dig deeper on what they want in terms of health and nutrition, how plant-based meat is delivering on their expectations today, where there might be opportunities to improve. And then finally, we're also using what we've learned about the attitudes and perceptions around plant-based meat to test messaging to figure out how to connect people in terms of these attributes that they're looking for the products. So a little preview of what's to come. Very interested in your feedback and thoughts on it as we roll these resources out. But for now, I'll turn it back over to Jody to talk about our immediate next steps.
Thanks so much, Taylor. So we just wanted to end on a final note here for those of you who maybe haven't seen this yet. We've also just published an introductory report on the segmentation that covers a lot of what we've gone through today, but also quite a lot more detail on each of the segments individually. And that is currently available on the GFI website. So I encourage you to take a look and read through that report. I think someone maybe will drop a link in the chat right now, but we'll also include it in the follow-up email that we send out to registrants after the webinar. So at this point, we would love to open it up to questions. We've had a lot of great questions come in so far in the Q&A box, but continue to submit them. And I'm going to invite our colleague Chelsea to join us and help facilitate the discussion.
Hi, folks. Thanks so much for joining. We have so many questions in the chat box, so thank you for submitting. Let's start with the first question that several folks submitted questions around this line of, are any of the segments more open to the meat-forward plant-based meats or analogs like Impossible, Beyond, etc., that are technically more processed, but are purposely trying to mimic meat, which is what makes them processed? Jody or
Am I
Taylor?
taking this one? Yeah, I'll jump in on this one. So first thing I'll say, and this is not specifically from the segmentation, but from some of our other research that we've published and can direct you to if helpful. While processing is obviously an important narrative around the industry today, the average consumer is just less aware of it than probably any of us on the call are, right? That said, and kind of taking it narrowly to what we can learn from the segmentation, like all of the six segments here are at least somewhat open to plant-based meat. So clearly haven't been totally dissuaded by narratives around processing, for example. Many of them are also not even primarily health motivated. Like they would eat something if it were high enough protein, even if they saw it as processed, for example. Um, they also care various amounts about processing. We'll get into this more when the full report gets released, but I think some of it will get profiled in the preview as well. Like, for example, I think we saw on one of those pages the ethical consumers and the health conscious compromiser segments. Those both say explicitly that they'd be interested in less processed plant-based meat products. So it's not the only concern or unmet need that either of those segments have around these products. Like the ethical consumers might also be interested in organic claims, for example, on plant-based meat. The compromisers might be interested in even lower fat or lower calorie products, for example. Um, so in short, it's not the top unmet need across segments. There are some segments who say they don't care very much about this and are choosing plant-based meat despite it, but some for whom less processed or like more clean label products could be a value add and a way to drive consumption in the future.
Thanks, Taylor. Wonderful. Let me kick it over to Jody for the next one because it's a separate but very related question, which is for one of the prevalent motivators for the most open to plant-based meats, i.e. the ethical alternative seekers, is more likely to eat less processed foods. So one of the, this person asking the question is saying one of the strongest and generally valid critiques of plant-based meat is that it is considered an ultra-processed food. So how should the field of plant-based meat producers address this?
Yeah, it's a great question, and we do, obviously know some of these segments care more than others about the ultra processed or just maybe processed issue in general. So the ethical alternative seekers are one, as referenced in the question, and also the health conscious compromisers, as Taylor mentioned. And we are doing some follow-up research right now to dig into those nuances around health and around related topics like processing, as Taylor referenced towards the end of the presentation. We do know in general from various research we've done that consumers have different perspectives on plant-based meat and whether it is processed. They have different perspectives on what being processed means in general. And I would say overall, they generally are less attuned to the concept of processing and ultra processed than we probably are in the industry. And in particular, I think a lot of consumers, the reality is they don't necessarily perceive plant-based meat to be processed or to feel that that's necessarily a barrier for them. But having said that, I think we also need to keep in mind that consumers, when they think about processing, they often have various cues or attributes they look to evaluate whether a product is processed. And so this is something we're digging more into in the research we're doing now, but we do know just directionally from past research we've done that consumers will think about or look at things like how many ingredients a product has, whether they recognize those ingredients. There might be certain ingredients they particularly, flag as feeling processed to them. So it's pretty important to understand these nuances. And I think some of those details, what's underneath that concept of being processed, can provide insight to producers on, what they might be able to do to address those concerns, right? Like, is it that the ingredient list needs to be shorter? Is it that a specific ingredient maybe is causing a concern? So all of that, I think we'll have a lot more, granularity on coming out of this next phase of research. We also know in general, there's just opportunity for consumer education around this topic. So I think the reality is for a lot of consumers, it just goes back to they don't necessarily understand, especially when we're talking about some of these analog products that really closely mimic animal meat. They don't understand exactly what they are or how they're made. And that tends to be sort of the root of a lot of concern and a lot of perception they're processed. So, we see just some education around some of those issues would probably aid a lot in alleviating some of these consumers' concerns around this particular topic.
Great. Thanks so much, Jody. Next question. Someone is wondering why folks in the Carefree Considerers segment would want to try plant-based meat.
I'm happy to take this one since I've got my microphone on still. I would say today, they are towards that right-hand side of the spectrum, right? So today, they are a little bit less open, and the reality is they don't recognize or understand a lot of the benefits of these products. And they don't maybe have a lot of salient needs, for example, around health that these products could potentially provide benefit on. Having said that, I think that segment does share some underlying needs with, for example, the protein maximizers. So they do, like carefree considerers do appreciate higher protein products. They appreciate products that give them energy. So there is something there that could potentially motivate them towards plant-based meat if it was the right product communicated in the right way. But again, I think with this segment, lack of current familiarity with plant-based meat, not seeing a lot of really salient benefits, and just generally the fact that they are quite routine driven in their food behaviors are going to be barriers to them to adopting plant-based meat in the near term.
Thanks, Jody. Another segment specific question that we have, which is about our health conscious compromisers. Why are folks in this segment less likely to eat plant-based meat in the future than other of the top 4 segments?
You want me to take this one and rest your voice for a second, Jody? All right. Yeah. So I think it goes back to those table stakes sanitation factors. Like it's taste in the economy, stupid. Like it goes very much to the basics for them. Um, we know these are general gaps for a lot of plant-based meat products, and that's just a segment that tends to over-index on these versus ones that perceive more positive benefits to them, like the health-focused things that the nutrition-focused integrators, the specific protein needs for the protein maximizers. I think it also partially goes back to them being more interested in these products for what they don't have in them, sort of things like lower fat, less cholesterol, which are, I think, often harder to market around and more specific than value added things like the protein, tasting like meat, etc. So if we want to make progress on those attributes for these segments, I think segments that show higher interest, are probably easier to marginally easier to address in the short term. One thing to note too is that this segment is also reducing at least their animal meat consumption today. So they're a little bit trickier and more nuanced in that sense than the other segment. But we think taste and price, if anything, is a clear way to win.
Lovely. Thanks, Taylor. Next question from our audience. Are nutrition-focused integrators eating the most plant-based meat of the segments, based on the slide where you referenced the highly engaged segments who consume other products?
Yeah, so there's a lot of, I guess, detail behind that question. The short answer is that that segment is the most likely to have eaten plant-based meat in the past year. However, they aren't necessarily eating it as often as some of the other segments. So I think a couple of slides before that, we had data on the average self-reported monthly consumption of the products, and they, I think, are third on the list in terms of that frequency. So there's a few other details behind that. I'll also just mention that as we continue to profile out these segments in the next report that we publish, we'll be providing a lot more granular detail around some of these consumption and purchase frequency questions. So we'll actually know very specifically based on validated purchase data, how often these segments are purchasing these products.
Thanks, Jody. One logistical question about the setup of the survey. What geographical area was surveyed to come up with these insights?
Yeah, I'm happy to take this one. And I saw there was also a question about how the survey was administered. So I can cover off on both of those at the same time. So we executed this initial survey, this core research in partnership with Ipsos, which is a large market research firm. So they administered this survey to their panel. They also supported with all of the statistical analysis that actually went into creating the segments themselves. And the survey was administered to US consumers aged 18 to 59. And within that group, we then weighted our final sample to ensure that it was demographically representative of the US population within those age ranges.
Hopefully, thanks. Going back to our health and ultra processed questions, which I think are really valuable. This person is noting more specifically, plant-based meat often relies on things like synthetic binders, like methyl cellulose, which some consumers are choosing to avoid. Why is this a growing concern, and how do you think it could be solved in the plant-based meat industry?
Yeah, I can take this one. I'll further pigeonhole myself into being the health focused guy here. So I think one, we can see how certain segments cluster around a desire for reduced harm products, like those health conscious compromisers in particular, very interested in products that are less bad for them. In tension with that, there's also obviously ones who would probably be more comfortable eating something that they see as less natural or processed or having additives if it can give them those other benefits they're looking for, like high protein, extra vitamins and minerals, etc. So that's a long way to say we don't have direct data on the methylcellulose thing yet, but we will be getting it as part of research on general, like specific health or specific nutrient and ingredient narratives. That and things like seed oils, for example, as part of that health focused research that we mentioned we're going to be doing. No specific timeline yet for publishing that, but it will give another layer of understanding on just what these segments are looking for and avoiding in terms of health and nutrition.
Amazing. Seed oils, hot topic. Looking forward to that one. Cool. Okay, just as a quick time check, we have about 4 minutes left, so I think we can maybe get to 2 more questions. One other question that folks are wondering is that folks, GFI will publish more information about the consumer's shopping behavior, but based on the segment's interaction or lack of interaction with plant-based meat analogs, where do consumers want to see plant-based meat shelved in store, either in next to other plant-based meat products, integrated with conventional meat products? Where are these consumers looking?
Yeah, so this is a great question, and I'm going to provide just some general context that's not necessarily specific or through the lens of the segments themselves. So GFI has done a lot of work around this question in the past, and I think the short answer here is generally that an integrated merchandising strategy has been shown to be most effective, meaning that plant-based meat is co-located with conventional meat products in the store. I think just to build on that and to reinforce the value in that merchandising strategy, as we look at the segments, we see that the majority of them are still eating conventional meat, right? This is not a full swap in their diet. So I think as you think about just their shopping behavior and what is convenient for them, probably that co-location, that integrated merchandising is going to be valuable. I think another point here is that, when we talk to consumers, and again, outside the context of the segmentation, we do hear increasingly that they are having trouble finding these products in the store. If they aren't looking or seeking out a nice specific plant-based meat section, they aren't necessarily seeing them routinely. And think about this in the context of a lot of these consumers are only consuming these products or purchasing these products maybe a couple of times a month. So this is not something that's on the regular shopping list. This is not a section of the store, if it is in its own isolated section that they're going to routinely. So again, it just reinforces the fact that having these products integrated with conventional meat products that these consumers are shopping still on a more routine basis is going to be the best way to, honestly, just get in front of them and remind them that they exist and just make it a much easier consumer shopping experience.
Incredible. Okay, our last question. Has GFI looked at the plant-based product journey that consumers take? Are they starting with plant-based dairy and then transitioning and trying other categories? Do we have any data on the consumer journey there?
I love this question. Not yet, but it's something that we've started gathering. We'll be looking to publish on in the future based on some of the findings for this, right? Like I think now having a richer understanding of how older versus younger clustering segments differ in their product level needs, seeing how many consumers are omnivores and therefore probably taking different sets of expectations onto these products versus being like the more vegetarian segments, and just generally looking for such a diversity of needs that might vary by life stage or change depending on their experience with the products. Something we're very mindful of and we'll be looking to do research on in the future.
Very cool. Love that question. Amazing. Well, we are at time. So a huge thank you to Jody and Taylor for sharing this overview of the segmentation. And thank you to our very engaged audience for your participation and many, many wonderful questions. As a reminder, as Kimberly has noted in the chat, today's seminar has been recorded and will soon be available up on GFI's YouTube channel. We'll also be emailing out a copy of everyone who registered for this session. And as GFI continues to drive progress in this space, we genuinely encourage you to share your ideas and feedback with us. You can email directly corporate@gfi.org, or reach out to any of us directly. Thanks again for joining and have a great rest of your day.